Hi everyone, my name is Wouter Tilp. I am a character designer living in the Netherlands. Thank you very much for inviting me to do a little workshop here at Pixelatl. As I mentioned, I live in the Netherlands, and I started out my career in 2002. And in the Netherlands, the industry is really small, so I started out just taking on any job that I could to make a living, and that caused me to be a caricature artist, a children's books artist, doing editorial illustrations, work for commercial, all kinds of stuff. And these first 10 years of my career, I was mostly doing that, which helped me to develop all kinds of techniques and styles. Then I got interested in animation, and I shifted my career gradually towards character design for feature animation, and that's what I've been doing the past 10 years, working for studios such as Netflix, Skydance, Sony Pictures Animation, Paramount. And what I want to do today is to create this small workshop where I share some of the things that I have learned over the years doing this kind of work. So I hope you will enjoy. Facial expression in character design is very important, as is body language. With those two, with the combination of those two, we can really say a lot about how a character feels, and that is extremely important because we want to connect to the characters we design. We want to understand how they feel, and so we use body language, to show the tension in the body, to show if a character is relaxed or tense. We can show by the body language if he's scared or not. But as you can see here, if we blur out the face, there's a lot we can still tell from that body language. This is a sculpture by Bernini David, ready to throw the rock at Goliath. But without his face, we don't really know how he feels while he is doing this. We can see in his body, that he is tense, he's preparing, but if we remove the blur and we see this, we feel like there's some kind of a nonchalance to it, like he doesn't really care that much, like he is not very afraid, and also he's not putting a lot of effort into making sure that rock gets thrown in the right place. Now, this is not the actual statue. I modified this because if we're looking at the actual facial expression, this is what it is. And you can see how effective this facial expression communicates the concentration. We can see the look in his eyes going in this direction. We can see the frown in the eyebrows, showing the intensity of that gaze. We can see how he's biting his lips, giving a lot of tension in this part of the face. All of that, we're as humans are so used to reading those small nuances within the face that this is a really good way of saying something, completing the story of this image that had the blur on. So there are a couple of things at play when it comes to drawing expressions of characters. Most important is the emotion, and I can draw the emotion if I feel the emotion of my character. So that's why for what you hear very often when people draw characters that have certain expression, the artist also has that same expression on his face while he's drawing this. Now, this is very important, if not essential, to draw the expression of the character. However, that is not something that we can use. What I mean with that is I cannot buy a pencil that will draw me angry faces. I cannot buy a pencil that will draw me fear. I can feel it, but I need to know what happens in the face. And before I go there, I want to draw facial expressions without the face. And what I mean with that is if I simplify a head shape to this, how can I show something of an expression if this is all I have? Well, I think if I add a neck to that, then that gives me something already. I could think of stretching this shape. I could think of squashing it. And without having much to work, we can already create something that is almost an expression. And I think this is really important to keep in mind, that a lot of an expression that we see comes from how the head is resting on the body. And I think this is something to really keep in mind. Also, what I'm starting to do here, this line right here, I'm starting to add stuff. And well, I think most of you will be familiar with squash and stretch. So if I go a little further with this one, for example, and I'll add some squash and stretch, you can see that we can get even more from that. Or with this one, adding some compression on this side, stretch on this side, gives me even stronger sense of facial expression. And so this is something I think you need to be aware of, because a smiling face, so let's just draw a smiling face here. This will look very different if it's on a neck that is stretched like this. Now the kid is reaching out, being really happy. It's a different feeling than if we see him do this. It's like he's up to something we're not supposed to know. So that's the first thing. And in a way, this is similar to what I mentioned here, facial expression in combination with body language. It's just the neck, but it's a very important part. Here I also added the shoulders, which is also very important. And I think it shows that the face is not separate from the body. It all works together, and we read the emotions with all these different. The next thing that is also very important is consistency. I think many people run into the problem of drawing a character design and not being able to draw this character from another angle, because the shapes, they don't line up, they don't match. It feels like it's a different character. So what I think, let me just get this one. So this is a design that I did, and what's important to see here is that we feel this is the same character, although I changed the shapes, but in general, these are the shapes we are looking at. So I can simplify, and basically what I'm saying when I say simplify, that's the key to drawing your character from another angle. So I want to go to a neutral version of this character, because I want to know what the standard version is.
if it's not, if it doesn't have an extreme facial expression. So I have something to start with. Well, actually the ears are a little bit lower in general. They're probably somewhere here. And so my neutral version here is not the same as my simplified version. I will get to that. In a neutral version, I'm still thinking of a lot of the details. And this could be, maybe the design I start out with. Maybe this is the character I designed before starting, to draw all these expressions. This might be the character that I landed on. I think it's a nice design. I'm leaving out the hat for now. So this is all nice, but how do I make sure that I can draw this character and create these facial expressions when, the face kind of changes, the eyes look a little different. Actually, I could include the pupil here. I think it's very clear that he has light eyes. And actually we have this shape going around the eyes. So I think that more or less gives us our neutral head shape. Now, as I mentioned, this is not the same as finding the volumes. And so if I were to find the volumes, this is what I would do. I would go over my design and basically do this. And I imagine this, if I were to sculpt this character, what would be the most simple shape that I would start with? And it's this kind of shape. And I'm using midlines and surface lines in order to achieve the effect of volume. So what that is midlines is a vertical line. If I would, with a pen, draw a line on that volume, this is the line that I would get. And it's interesting, you can take a random shape and you can create a midline however you want, and it will create a volume that can be completely different. If I do this, the shape is completely flattened, but if I do this, I can create a volume, especially if I add the next thing, which is surface lines. So if I think of a line wrapping around this shape horizontally, and obviously this line is something that I wouldn't be able to see, but this I could see. If I would do the same thing here, add surface lines, I can manipulate this shape even more and really create the illusion of volume. And I could add more lines like this. And the curves that I choose will help to define the volumes of this object. Now, even though it's still this flattened shape that I started out with, it's starting to look like a shape that has a certain volume. You can think of this as a computer grid. Now, I made this a little complex, but I don't want to create something complex here. I want to create something simple. So I'm going to keep this as simple as possible in order to create my volumes. And then we have the eyes. I may have overlapped a little bit here. I think that couldn't be happening, obviously. And I am putting these in there, but actually what I want to do is to leave them out for now. Let's go back a little bit, and I could even leave this out because what's important is this basic shape, and I could do the same thing with that as I did before with these squash and stretch faces. I can squash and stretch this basic shape without having an expression yet, but you can see that it will give me a lot of expression without having an actual expression. I could draw this sideline in here as well. Here I'm turned a little bit more in this direction so I can see more of this sideline. This line, as I imagine, if I stretch this, I imagine the jaw opens. So this line stretches. This line, which is a horizontal, gets stretched down also because this stretches. Let me increase this so we can see more clearly. So I could do the same thing, squashing it, thinking this character could be more angry, for example. I'm not saying this is literally the technique I use when drawing my character designs. What happens actually, I think, when you draw your facial expressions is you combine these techniques. So what you'll do is you will think of how a character feels, and you feel that emotion, but you're also thinking of the techniques of volumes, and you're also thinking of the details in the face, what's happening within the face. All those things you're combining. I'm now just focusing on squashing and stretching the basic head shape, and we can imagine even here, if I add the body here, just like I did before, I already have this expression. If I do the same here, thinking that shoulder may be going up, I have very different expressions. Now what's very important in a facial expression is the eyebrows and the mouth. They are really important in creating believable facial expressions, and also because they're really defining. So for example, if I want to emphasize this angry face, I can bring in the eyebrows so here I'm drawing an arrow now here, so that eyebrow is pushing down, and I could have the mouth go up, if I want to have that lip push forward in that direction. Maybe this stretches in this direction. So with only the eyebrows and the mouth, I can create a lot of expression already. Here, for example, I can have the eyebrows go up, make him feel surprised, for example. I can have the mouth open, so this feels like it's stretched, you know, maybe. We have the corners of the mouth go in these directions, and the eyebrows go in these directions. Now, what happens when I draw these elements is that I'm thinking really of curves. I'm thinking of curves, and I'm also thinking of the right perspective. I want to keep the perspective consistent. So when you look at this curve, I'm thinking of static shapes versus dynamic shapes. So if I explain that, if I think of a square, that is very much a static shape. You know, if I divide it, I can flip it and we have the exact same shape. I can divide it like this and still it's the exact same shape. So that makes it very static, you know. Same for a circle, and this is obviously a mess, but if you have a perfect circle, even more than a square, I can divide it any way I want to and I will get half a circle. Same shape. Now if I do that with this shape, that won't happen. You know, this is a dynamic shape, and same with this one. Doesn't mean that it has to have curved lines. I can have a straight line in there as well. Dynamic shape. I can flip this and have the same shape. So another thing that I'm doing here is this curve I would call a dynamic curve, since it's not part of a circle. You know, we have an emphasis. There's a point where I feel that's where the push or the pull is, and this is all stretching towards that point. Now that is the kind of curve I'm drawing here. I want to create that point where I feel the strength is strongest and everything goes from there. And same here, you know, I want to have those points going down, but that top of the lip is just a little higher, so it can't go down. Otherwise it would. I was saying I'm also thinking of perspective. So I'm thinking of this curve. Let's say this is, you know, if I divide it, this is a symmetrical action of the eyebrows. Then because of the foreshortening, this curve isn't exactly the same as this curve. So I'm taking into account perspective as well. So now I want to include the eyes, obviously. So in my generic head that I drew, so let me get this one up here. So let's have this as an example. So that's my design. That's what I'm referring to. So I can see the eye shape, and it looks like this. So I didn't draw it really clearly here, but the way I designed it is here we have one corner of the eye and here we have one corner. So this corner is a little higher, a little more towards the back of the head. This one is a little more in front and a little lower. So it's not a complete circle, although it almost is. I'm trying to relate this to an actual eye. So that's my eye shape. Now what's extra useful here is this line that I designed, because I know literally how it, as I call it, walks over the surface. It basically is a surface line, because I can draw surface lines perpendicular to the midline, but I can also draw them, you know, almost like you would see in these height maps of mountain areas. You know, you can just think of it as slicing a part of this. You know, what would that look like? And that's basically what this is. You know, I'm drawing a line on his face, and so if this stretches and this also goes down, this line would also stretch. Here also we can hardly see it, but it's also on the opposite side, obviously. And so within that we have the eye. So first thing what I would do is to think of the points that are fixed. So for example, this is a point that is fixed, and there are not many of them, but the top of the head would be. I'm saying there are not many of them. Clearly there are a lot of them, but as I'm squashing and stretching so much, you can see the entire shape of the head looks different, but this point is still fixed. And I know, this point is, I can call this a fixed point, but as you can see, I'm dropping this line much more than I'm doing here. I could even have this go up a little bit. So, but there are some points that are fixed, and these points of the eyes, they are, they can't really move, so I can put those in place. In this case, the eye here, if we have that point right here, the eye might even overlap this point. So if I draw that a little bigger, the eye right here having this point, and if I would draw a surface line or an eyelid around the eye, it would go like this, and that would be the other point. So my eye is overlapping that point. I can have the iris in there, for example. So here I'm drawing that shape in there, and I'm stretching it. From this point and this point, I'm creating a curve like this. I'm trying to think, what is the lowest point of the eye? Where is the force strongest? Well, I think, if this is all pulling, this could be the point where it's pulling strongest. This, again, I want to create a curve that tells me there is tension in there. If I create a wobbly line, then I'm losing that effect. So I'm trying to create a curve that creates tension. Now, another thing that I'm thinking of is the curve of the eyebrow. So if you look at these two lines, there's a relationship there. There is this kind of rhythm where we feel the force is increasing. If I would have those curves being symmetrical, or have the same curve, the same distance throughout, I'm losing that effect of tension. It becomes less effective than when I think of the fact that, let's say, the eyebrow is the force that stretches the eye. So if this is the stronger curve, I want to have a pointier shape there, because that pointy part of it, that's where the force is strongest, and that part of the eyebrow is the thing that stretches the eye. Now the eye is a sphere, so if I would draw a midline there, that would look like this. And you can see, if it's almost like a fish eye or something. It creates this clear illusion of a rounded eye, a sphere. Now here as well, I need to draw this as if, thinking of it in terms of perspective. And if I would draw the eye on here, so I could draw that as a circle and keep that consistent. That's up to me. That's it with squash and stretch. It's really fun because you can play around deciding what you want. I can also stretch the entire iris. So that's up to you. And when it comes to squash and stretch, I like to think of it in terms of hard and soft substances. So for example, if I have, the head consists of bones, and it consists of flesh, soft tissue, and in this case hair as well. Now it's up to me to decide whether I want to squash or stretch the bones as well, or maybe I want them to be hard shapes, and I want the skin and the soft parts to be the soft shapes. That is something that you can decide. There are no rules for that, and actually you can play with it. You can see what works best. If there is an earring, let's say there's an ear, I could draw that earring like this, like it's also stretched, but I can also make sure that that is exactly rounded, showing how that is a hard material. Depending on what you want to express with your design, you can choose whether you want to squash or stretch. So let's move to this one. In this case, we have the eyes right here. So again, we can think of those points that are fixed, and in this case, the eye is being overlapped by the eyebrow, and actually I can draw it like this. Let's see, I can have a wrinkle in here if I want. So what I'm trying to do here, if I increase the scale a little bit, it's a little messy in here, but what is really important here is overlaps. So making sure that one shape goes in front of the other, and that give me clarity in the design. Now, since I drew a little small, that clearly gets lost a little bit, but hopefully the idea is clear. What I could also do here is think of, since this is squashed so much, the lower eyelid could come over the eye as well, giving some extra visual interest. Now, I haven't really designed the eyebrows. I think they're a little thicker here. But there's much more that I haven't designed yet, and that's the thing. What I want to emphasize here is that I start with the simple shapes, because the simple shapes can clearly be designed in space. And if you think of every element as a simple shape, you can start adding elements. But especially, work from big to small, because that will help you to be able to handle all the different elements. For example, if I want to draw the ears, or maybe even better, if I want to add the hat that I had in the original design, then I can think of squash and stretch in the very. So first thing is to understand how the hat wraps around the head. So I can, in this case, I probably wouldn't want to have it completely perpendicular to the face, but a little more pushed over his eyes. So the back is a little higher than the front. But then I need to take into account the roundness of the head. And this is, if I understand my volumes, this is the surface line, and I can draw it just like that. Let me just continue on a separate layer here so I can make that extra clear. So then the basic shape, I want this to lean over forward as he is really angry. I think having that cap overlap, and I need to, wait, let me draw this first. So what I want to focus on here is I want to make sure that this line doesn't create a tangent with the eyebrow. So what that means is I don't want the eyebrow to touch this line right here, because if two lines touch, and I can show best right here, if I have a square and I have another square like this, it's very clear to see which square is in the front. But if I do it like this, I can't see which square is overlapping the other. Or maybe, this is not even a square. Maybe it's this shape, but it's being overlapped by this shape. Now I can't see if I separate them like this, or I can see if I take them apart just slightly, for example, like this. Then it becomes clear. I still don't know exactly what's behind there. I can't tell here. It's an illusion, but the illusion is much stronger if we have these T shapes, like the letter T, unlike these ongoing lines that won't give me any information. And that's the very same thing I'm doing here. I'm making sure that this line right here overlaps the eyebrow here. That's my T shape. There's my T shape. So I want to make my design as clear as possible. And so here again we have another T shape. So that's the cap of the hat. Now I want to create the rest of it as well. So going back to that surface line, now as I imagine it leaning forward a little bit, I'm starting with the big shape first, but I know that this is going to be stretched, and I know that on this side it's going to be compressed, so I can draw that shape. And again, trying to think of a curve that has emphasis, unlike a curve that is part of a circle. Compression on this side. Now, I don't know exactly the design of the hat, but I'm just making sure that whatever the design is, you can decide for yourself what you want that shape to look like. Most important is to know that it will deform as force is being applied to it. Now, there we have an element, placed on top of the design. I'm coloring it so it's a little clearer how that overlaps the drawing underneath. But again, what I hope is clear, that I start with this big shape, and from there on, and this is the midline here behind surface line, and then I think, well, this stretches, so this compresses, so that volume kind of creates these kinds of curves in there. But since we are looking at it in a foreshortened way, the overlaps come towards us, so that's why I created these kinds of curves. Then we can add the ears. Again, volumes that are placed at the side. We can't see this ear, we can't see this one. I can draw this as a geometric shape first. That way I can make sure the design in terms of perspective is correct, and from there on it's much easier to simplify it. But first I want to make sure I get the perspective right, because the volumes are really essential to make this design believable. So I'm placing it here a little, it's like it's on the middle of that midline. And if I lower the opacity, it gives me room to draw that shape on there in a more playful way. And same with these, the brushy hair right there. Those are all things I can add later on. But what I do want to mention here is that effect of squash and stretch is still happening. So you can imagine this curve, it kind of pushes out, and you can imagine if normally it's this curve and we have the hairs like this, just simplifying. And now we have a much stronger curve like this that affects also the direction of these hairs. So I can imagine we would emphasize that also a little bit. And what I've learned is that being consistent in squash and stretch throughout the design really makes the design much more believable, because if you leave out these kinds of details, then you will feel that there is squash and stretch happening in the design, but since the hairs do not join in, it doesn't feel consistent. It doesn't feel like this is actually force that's happening in the design. Drawing in this line right here. So it's nice to see how much different it is compared to our line right here, where it stretches, and here it really compresses, becomes much more. We still have some time to move back to this one, creating the nostrils. As this is a shape in perspective, so that means this side is bigger than this side, so that affects the nostrils as well. This one will be smaller. One thing that I really want to show, because I see that it's often overlooked, is the perspective. So I created these surface lines. As you look here, I'm making sure that everything is part of the same perspective. Now, what's funny about facial expressions is that asymmetry is a very powerful thing. Now, I created these facial expressions and they are very symmetrical, but I think if you would add some asymmetry in there, they would become even more important, more effective. So for example, if one of the eyebrows goes up a little more than the other, and maybe we see a little bit of this lower eyelid, maybe we see a little stretch on this side, maybe the mouth is a little pushed towards this direction, and maybe that is shown also in this part. Different elements, those are things that really will bring life to your design. So in short, that comes down to volumes, making sure the volumes are consistent, but you can also create the foundation of your facial expression with just volumes and how the face, how the head sits on the neck. Then with those volumes, the eyebrows and the mouth, you can create the foundation for your facial expression in a very easy way. And then what's really important to understand is that the head shape consists of two parts basically. If you have a regular skull, then we have this part and we have the jaw. And the jaw is separate from the top part of the skull. Now that is interesting, and that is where we can create a lot of asymmetry as well, because if let's say the eyebrows do this, the mouth does this, underneath we can have, if we would draw the skull, we can have the skull like this, but we can have the lower jaw do this, and that could create a lot of asymmetry. It could squash this part much more. It could create a lot of variation in how we address those volumes. And then you can play with the direction of all your elements, like the ears. I'm pointing this one in this direction, so I'm emphasizing basically that stretch on this side and that compression on this side. I could emphasize that even with the hat on top of it. Everything helping to tell my story of what the force, what the movement of this expression actually is. And maybe the eyebrow should be a little lower, but you can see that those are basically the overall shape that I'm drawing for this design. You know, the simplified shapes, they are dynamic shapes. They're not part of a circle. They are not part of a square. There are no parallel lines. You know, and if I see them, for example, here, those are almost parallel lines. I try to avoid them because not because I'm against drawing parallel lines, but especially in a design where I want to create the feeling of movement, the feeling of force, the feeling of action, then design shapes that will emphasize staticity, something static is something I want to avoid. So you can imagine this gives me a lot more feeling of movement than a design that looks like this. You know, it looks much more stiff. So that can be useful for the design of shapes, but if you want to put them in action, you want to create dynamic shapes, and especially you want to create dynamic volumes. So that's where your surface lines come in, you know, like we did right here, in order to create those volumes and show how they affect one another. So our time is up. I hope this has been helpful. It's a short amount of time, but hopefully I was able to explain something about character design that helps you on your path. So thank you very much for attending, and I hope to see you soon.
Hi, Wouter. Thank you for joining us all the way from the Netherlands. Welcome to Mexico.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
That was a really fantastic masterclass. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks.
Let me just start in on the questions, if it's okay.
Yes.
Our first question comes from Cinnamon Art. How do you know how to stylize so well without losing the anatomical structure?
Well, that is a good question. That is always a tricky thing, because when you want to do expressive characters, you're always balancing gesture versus anatomy or dimensionality, and if you focus on one, you tend to lose the other. If it's all gesture, your drawing becomes fluid, but it feels like it's falling apart. And if you're focusing on structure so much, drawings tend to get stiff. My experience is that when you study it over time, you will learn how to balance it. So that's one part of it. It's just keep going, because things will fall into place in time. The other thing, I like to start with gesture. If you think of that exercise where you draw a random shape, you can always find a way to turn it into a face. And if you think of gesture that way, you find your line of action, your gesture, you can create that shape that gives you the dynamics, the feeling of weight or the feeling of movement. And once that is in place, you can fill that with the structure. And so if you make sure that the gesture comes first, and almost like that random shape, turning it into a face, you can get away with breaking the structure if the gesture is believable. And so no one will notice that arm is a little too long if that is a strong gesture. The other way around doesn't really work, because if the construction is perfect, but we don't feel that gesture, or the balance is off, or doesn't feel like there's weight in there, then even though it's perfect anatomy or perfect structure, your drawing will feel like it's falling apart.
Thank you. I think that in part that does also answer a bit of our next question from Scarlett, but she's got a question really about cleaning up drawings, and saying that when she's cleaning up her drawings, they end up looking a little bit stiff and they lose that organic gesture. Or do you have any tips to stop that happening at the cleanup stage?
That is what a lot of people struggle with, I think. We do our sketching and it looks so vivid and loose and playful. And then when we clean up, the drawing looks stiff and all the life seems to get sucked out of it. And I think part of it is because that sketching stage is so intuitive and you can feel us searching for the right line and there's life in that drawing. So personally, I also try to create a workflow where I can keep some of that in there. Then still, sometimes you just want to clean up the drawings. And I think it's important to learn not to trace your sketch, but really to keep in mind what is it you want to express with that drawing, which lines are important, are there overlaps that need to be clear, is the silhouette still clear? Sometimes we treat all the lines in the very same way, and so the whole drawing seems equally important in terms of line weight, and you can use that line weight to suggest gravity or to suggest a gesture, and some elements in your design like texture or folds may be less important than the actual shape of the arm. So I think a lot of it has to do with creating a balance between parts of your drawing that are really important and elements that are less important, or at least don't need to be the first thing that you look at.
Thank you. You touched on silhouette in what you were saying there in response to Scarlett's question. Cesar Garces is asking, what exercises can you recommend to improve the silhouette and the general shape of a character?
Okay. Well, what I like to do, my son used to do capoeira. And I used to sit and sketch. And what's really difficult is that they're constantly moving. So it's like they're dancing and doing, standing on their hands. And so what I try to do is to take this mental picture and to draw it as a silhouette. And so at first, it's really frustrating because they move so fast that it feels like an impossible task. But gradually I noticed that I got better at it because you will start to learn what the essential lines are to effectively show that specific pose. So I think that's a great exercise. Actually, drawing silhouettes of your characters is a good exercise in itself, because you only use the outside line of your design to express the pose or the attitude of that character. So you will become really conscious of the shapes you're using and how they work together. So another exercise that you could do is to focus on, let's say, a photo or a reference image, and do a drawing where you draw the silhouette, and then try to exaggerate the silhouette in a way where the shapes become more appealing or the gesture becomes stronger. So if you just use silhouette to do that, you will automatically start to see when which silhouettes will express a pose that is more stiff or balanced, or silhouettes that express movement, for example. So I hope this answers the question.
Thank you. Natalia Santos is asking, how do you make sure the character stays consistent even when you're changing its proportions?
Well, I hope I explained some of that in the video. I think of it like water balloons. A water balloon has a certain shape, but when you squeeze it, the shape completely changes, but the volume of it always stays the same. The amount of water inside of the balloon doesn't change. So when you apply squash and stretch, clearly it's not rocket science, but in my mind, I try to think of it like that, so that I can't stretch the entire character or the face, open the mouth really far, but or let's say a character is reaching, uh, then I can make him reach very far. But if I exaggerate that really to an extreme, the character will become really thin. You can see this in old Tex Avery cartoons. I think that's a great reference, or Chuck Jones cartoons for squash and stretch, and exactly what you're asking about, because that's actually what I studied to learn about squash and stretch, because they had such a great way to deal with changing the shapes, really almost like they were made of chewing gum, and stretching them and squashing them, and still maintaining the balance. So I think in general there are a few points that will stay in place, that uh, parts of the face that will stay in place, and parts will stretch around it. Um, like, if, for example, if the corner of my nose and the point will stay more or less in place if I stretch the entire face. Because if I stretch every part of my face, then I'm actually changing the design of the face. So you want to find a balance. I think caricatures is also a very good reference to look at that, because they also, sometimes you see the eyes and the nose and the corners of the mouth. Well, the corners of the mouth can go all the way here, but you see some parts, they will stay in place, and some parts, they will extend to a very extreme. And, it is a thing where you have to develop a sense for it. I can't really say, well, this is what you need to put there, and this is what you need to put there, and then it'll work. But if you study, those kinds of examples, I think you will get an idea of how this works, because they, especially those cartoons, I think they did it in a very simple and very effective way.
I'm going to hand over just briefly to Christian to continue with these questions. I'll be back in a moment.
Okay.
Thanks, Christian.
Okay.
I think I am anyway. If Christian is there.
Yes. Yeah, you can turn your. There we go. Hello.
Hi, Christian.
No, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you, and also thank Science Institute for making this talk possible. And yeah, thanks to the magic of the internet, we can do this.
Yes.
Let's hope we can do this in person once everything is over. But yeah, let's get back to the questions. So Emilia S. When doing a character that doesn't have an iris nor a pupil, how can emotion be reflected correctly?
If a character doesn't have an iris or a pupil, I think then you will have to work with other elements